The photograph was taken at precisely 2:15 in the afternoon on October 19, 1883. Gregory Lyle, a retired tinsmith with neatly pressed trousers and a navy wool vest, stood inside the narrow confines of Harlan's Daguerreian studio in Bellbrooke, Maine. His boots were polished, though the right one showed signs of wear near the toe. The gray in his mustache was heavy, and his right hand trembled slightly as he folded it over the left. He didn't smile. Few did in portraits of the time. Instead, he stared squarely into the large brass lens of the Mulgrave box camera, his expression still, composed, though not without unease. Behind him, draped in the shadows of the curtained rear wall, stood something that would unravel everything the town knew about its own history. It was a door, tall and arched, black-stained wood with 6 thin vertical panes of dull glass. It loomed just behind Gregory's left shoulder. There was no doorknob, no trim, no hinges visible along the frame. The base of the door hovered just above the studio's wood-planked floor, not by much, perhaps 2 inches, but enough to feel wrong. Stranger still, there was no shadow cast beneath it, no soft outline, no interruption in the light falling from the overhead arc lamp. "I heard something," Gregory had muttered moments before the shutter click, shifting his weight slightly. The photographer, Mr. Harlan, brushed off the comment with a tired sigh and returned to his notes. He had 12 more sittings that week. "Do keep still, Mr. Lyle." The exposure is brief, but precision matters. Gregory didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on the lens, but his thoughts drifted behind him, to the strange pressure in the air. It wasn't cold, but he had begun to sweat under his collar. The air had turned dense, as though something else was breathing in the room, slow, measured, deliberate. When the shutter clicked and the moment was captured, neither man said anything. Harlan packed away the glass plate with the same routine care he afforded every client. He did not glance back at the door. He did not mention it again. And for 31 years, the plate sat undisturbed. Not until 1914 did anyone uncover it again, sealed in a thin oak cabinet behind 2 drawers of nitrate negatives labeled only G. Lyle, do not enlarge. That discovery came during a long overdue restoration of local archives at the Bellbrooke Museum. The man responsible for pulling the drawer open, a junior archivist named William Merritt, had intended to catalog Civil War pensioner portraits for a town centennial project. He wiped the glass clean with a soft cloth, held it up to the light, and paused. The figure of Gregory Lyle was clear, familiar, as expected, but behind him, William squinted. "That's not right." He adjusted the lamplight and tilted the plate. The door behind Gregory was sharply defined, its arch curving unnaturally close to the top frame of the studio wall. Yet something deeper unsettled William, a subtle impossibility in the way the base of the door didn't meet the floorboard. No shadow, no alignment with the vertical seams of the wooden planks. It appeared as though the door had been imposed on the space, not built into it. Worse, the floorboard just beneath it seemed interrupted. Not broken, not edited, but shifted. The planks flowed naturally across the studio until they reached the door, and then bent upward slightly, like a ripple beneath the surface of still water. He called for his supervisor. Within hours, the plate had drawn quiet concern from the Bellbrooke Antiquarian Society, especially from its chairman, Edgar Belson, a sharp-nosed man with a background in architectural surveying. "No record of this," Belson said flatly, after examining the original floor plans of Harlan's Daguerreian studio. "No doors on the north wall, only a sitting bench and the backdrop canvas." They checked the studio ledger from that fall. Gregory Lyle's appointment was listed on October 19th, with a brief note in Harlan's stiff handwriting. Client fainted on exposure, recovered after salts. No mention of unusual props, no notes on set changes. By the week's end, the photograph had become an object of silent unease among the museum's staff. One curator refused to handle the plate again. Another claimed he could hear wood creaking when he stood near the storage cabinet. No one dared say the word haunted, but the discomfort was spreading, unspoken but felt. Belson ordered a professional reprint. He expected photographic artifact, a lighting trick, an accident, a fold in backdrop fabric. But the reprint, made with standard contact procedures, revealed the same details. The door remained, suspended, real yet unreal. In a private letter to the local mayor, Belson concluded his findings plainly. No architectural structure matching the photograph exists in any surviving plan, nor in any registry record, nor in any known building in Bellbrooke. This door, whatever it may be, appears in that single photograph, and then nowhere else on earth. The boy screamed the moment the shutter dropped. It wasn't loud, but sharp, a dry, instinctive gasp that echoed too long inside the narrow walls of Harlan's Daguerreian studio. Gregory Lyle stood frozen in his polished boots, shoulders locked, mouth slightly ajar. The smell of collodion and gaslight oil clung to the air like damp wool. Behind the camera hood, Harlan himself, Joseph Harlan, proprietor and lensman, lowered the black shroud with practiced hands, expression unreadable. "Mr. Lyle," he asked, stepping around the box tripod, "you've gone pale." Gregory didn't speak. His eyes had drifted slightly to the left of the camera lens, fixed now on something deeper, something just behind him. The faint click of glass drying on its plate echoed like a bone snapped clean. A moment passed. Then Gregory's knees buckled. He collapsed with a dull thud against the dark floorboards, his head striking the back leg of the studio chair. Harlan rushed forward, catching him awkwardly under the arms. The iron scent of salts and silver hung thick in the room. "Sal," Harlan called out the back door, voice tense, "fetch the ether salts." And hurry. It took nearly 15 minutes to revive him. When Gregory finally stirred, blinking beneath the flicker of gaslight, his lips moved without sound. Harlan leaned in. Gregory was whispering something. 3 words, again and again. It was open. He said it once more before his body shivered violently and he pushed himself upright, ignoring Harlan's hand. "I'll pay in full," Gregory rasped, reaching for his coat. "Just, please." "Don't send me the print," Harlan didn't argue. In all his years photographing pensioners, clergymen, grieving widowers, he'd seen tears, breakdowns, and even a fistfight once, but never that look. Whatever Gregory Lyle had seen in that lens, it hadn't been the back wall of the studio. The ledger note that day, in Harlan's exact script, was brief but telling. Client fainted on exposure, recovered after salts. The photograph was tucked carefully into a wax paper sleeve and sealed, unprinted in a cabinet drawer marked October. But that wasn't the end. Over the next few weeks, Harlan grew uneasy in his own space. He kept returning to the far wall, the one behind where Lyle had stood, checking for cracks, checking the paint, testing for drafts. Sometimes, when no clients were in, he would pull the heavy chair back to the exact spot and stare toward the camera, mimicking the composition. There was nothing unusual, and yet something was off. In December 1883, Harlan confided in a friend, Constable Evan Ridley, that the studio felt colder near the center of the room. "Only in a ring," he explained, tracing the air above the floor with his boot. "You don't feel it unless you stand there. But when you do, it's like something's breathing." Ridley offered a laugh and a theory: faulty insulation. But Harlan wasn't so sure. The town of Bellbrooke, Maine, was small enough that news traveled fast, even if not by word of mouth. A ledger of 17 sittings followed Gregory's that fall, and, according to town records, 5 of those clients never returned to collect their plates. Not one gave a reason. By spring of 1884, Harlan had begun taking fewer appointments. His studio lights, once burning warm each evening, dimmed earlier and earlier. The final entry in his ledger came in March, a schoolteacher named Alfred Neer, whose only note beside his name read, Did not speak. Paid in coin. Stared too long. After that, the pages went blank. The building itself would survive for 13 more years, but it wouldn't be used again as a photography space. By 1891, a police memorandum, filed by the same Constable Ridley, described the structure as shuttered, unfit for occupancy, no ingress at rear. The back alley was choked with weeds and broken glass, the windows smeared with soot. Inside, the walls had begun to bend outward from the base. It was as if something beneath the floorboards had swelled and shifted, not from moisture, but from pressure. Ridley's report included a peculiar final note. No fixtures, but found footprint impressions inside where no dust had settled. In 1896, a fire tore through the eastern half of Bellbrooke's main street. Harlan's studio, still standing, though barely, was the first to collapse. The blaze was brief and localized. No neighboring buildings were lost, yet no survivors were pulled from the studio, though none were reported inside. 1 week later, the ruins were razed. No attempt was made to rebuild. For years, the lot remained empty, a scar in the heart of town, fenced off by warped timberboards and brass nails. But the story of the studio didn't fade. In 1903, a retired newspaperman named Howard Merton compiled oral accounts from Bellbrooke's elderly residents. The most frequent topic? A dream. Men, all men, reported seeing a black door in their sleep, arched, wooden, without a knob, standing upright in fields, hallways, even in places that held no walls. Most of them couldn't remember walking through it, only that it stood open, always just a few feet away. Some called it a passage. Others said it watched them. In 1907, local folklorist Ellison Crane published a slim pamphlet called The Door That Dreams Us. It sold less than 50 copies, but contained something rare. A sketch from a child's notebook dated January 1884, kept in the archives of Bellbrooke Primary School. The sketch showed a hill, badly drawn, and a door rising from its center, floating just above the grass. A crude arrow pointed to it with the words, "Open now." The child's name was Thomas Wren, age 9. He had died of fever 2 weeks after the drawing was made. None of the town's architectural plans, those drafted in 1875, 1880, or even the newer blueprints from 1885, make mention of any structure in Bellbrooke with a door of that design. Arched top, 6 vertical panes, black stained with no visible hinge or handle, and yet in every surviving record from Harlan's studio, that particular session, October 19, 1883, remained the only sitting with a missing client photograph. No prints, no contact sheets, no enlargement attempts, not until 1914. Even then, when the glass plate was finally recovered and examined, no one could explain the anomaly. And as Bellbrooke's museum curators would later say, with chilled certainty, to this day, not a single photograph from that studio session shows the studio as it truly was. At exactly 11:32 a.m. on October 2, 1914, the lights flickered once in the back room of Northridge Preservation Archive. Henry Brohl didn't look up. The flicker was common. Gas-fed lamps had their moods, especially in the older sections of the facility. What mattered more was the fragile glass plate resting between his gloved hands, its label yellowed and peeling. G. Lyle, do not enlarge. Brohl, a precise man of habit, had worked at Northridge for 14 years and rarely ignored a directive. But today, something gnawed at the edge of his reason, something in the grain of the glass itself. The emulsion coating felt thicker than it should, resistant somehow. As he carefully slid the plate onto the contact printer, he frowned. "Why mark a simple civic portrait for no enlargement?" he muttered, aligning the plate and sensitized paper under the frame's brass hinge. He secured it shut, flicked the lamp arm forward, and began the exposure. When the print emerged, still damp and faint, Brohl saw it immediately. The door. A tall, arched shape rising behind Gregory Lyle, black-stained wood with 6 narrow vertical panes of glass. But what stopped Brohl cold wasn't the door's appearance. It was its position. He leaned forward, measuring the studio's floorboard alignment against the base of the door. His pencil scratched along a straight edge. 2 inches. The base of the door hovered, literally floated, 2 inches above the established floor line in the image. Worse, Lyle's shadow bent into the doorframe unnaturally, as though drawn toward it. "That's not a normal bend," he said aloud, his voice sounding too sharp in the quiet room. His breath clouded slightly in the air. He paused. That was strange. The darkroom wasn't cold. He scribbled a note in the margin of the lab journal. Either the subject was against a wall, or the wall gave way to something else. Wanting to test for distortion, Brohl adjusted the frame and attempted a second enlargement using an 8x10 lens setup. The process took longer, about 25 minutes from start to finish. As the image clarified under the fixer, he stared. The panes in the door's glass, those narrow vertical windows, reflected the room behind the subject. But something was wrong. The wall sconces appeared reversed. The angle of the shelves in the background didn't match, and, most unnerving of all, Lyle was missing from the reflection entirely. Brohl stepped back, suddenly uneasy. His pulse kicked up. He turned toward the darkroom thermometer on the back wall. 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Weather outside was overcast, he recalled. That part wasn't surprising, but his breath again fogged as he exhaled. It wasn't supposed to be this cold in a sealed room lit by 3 gas fixtures. He reached for his notepad but hesitated. There was something else, an odor, faint but distinct, like scorched fabric or old wiring. No, not wiring. Dust. Burnt dust. He moved toward the nearest window and checked the sash. Closed. Locked. No drafts. Later that afternoon, as the day dimmed toward evening, he summoned curator Theda Wren, who often reviewed prints before archival storage. She was a quiet man in his 50s, meticulous and deeply respectful of artifacts. Brohl showed him the reprint. Wren stood over the image, squinting behind round wire spectacles. "Something's off," he said, voice low. "The lighting, it makes the door real, but not the room." Brohl pointed to the shadow line beneath Lyle's feet. "And look here." His own shadow is pulling toward it. Wren didn't speak for a long time. He moved closer to the plate still drying in the tray, examining it under the hanging magnifier. Then he stepped back and hugged his arms across his chest. "Did you open a window?" "No. Why?" "It felt colder near the plate. I thought someone opened a window." Brohl shook his head slowly. "Not unless ghosts have started using the sash locks." Wren sniffed. "What's that smell?" "I thought it was the fixer reacting. But it doesn't match. Smells like burnt dust," Wren finished. He walked to the cabinet and made his own note in the ledger. His handwriting was clipped and exact. Room colder than expected. Smell of char. No known source. The 2 men stood in silence, the photograph resting between them on the drying cloth. Both of them fixated now on the panes of glass in the mysterious door. Their reflections seemed too vague, too soft, like the light inside the photo swallowed anything looking in. Brohl leaned over the table once more and stared into the door's mirrored panes. His own reflection was there, but faint, distorted. Then he blinked. There was something in the 4th pane. Just for a moment. A shift of movement behind where Gregory Lyle would have stood, but nothing human, nothing defined, like smoke caught in glass, sliding toward the edge of frame. He pulled away fast, breath hitched. "You saw something," Wren said sharply. I don't know." Brohl wiped his palms on his coat. Neither man spoke further. Wren quietly gathered the notes and left the room without saying goodbye. Brohl sat back down and glanced at the final margin scrawl he'd written that morning. The words suddenly felt heavier. One detail remained impossible to explain. The reflection inside the door showed no photographer. The temperature in the viewing chamber dropped noticeably the moment the glass plate was removed from its box. Archivist Henry Broll stiffened, glancing toward the gas lamp that flickered unnaturally despite the still air. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, now feeling too thin for the sudden cold. The plate, Gregory Lyle's portrait, or what the museum notes had recently begun referring to as the door print, rested in its brass-hinged cradle, gleaming faintly under the glow. Broll wasn't alone. 3 men stood spaced around the room, each from a different discipline, each summoned quietly by the Northridge Preservation Consortium. None had met before that morning. Their brief was simple. Explain the door. The first to step forward was Dr. Amos Delling, a tall man with owl-like spectacles and a voice that rarely rose above a murmur. A professor of optics from Winsbridge College, he carried a velvet-lined case under his arm and moved like someone who distrusted floorboards. Without a word, Delling knelt beside the cradle, opened his case, and pulled out a spathic lens, its edges polished to clarity. He lowered the lens toward the plate and peered in. His breath caught. "Curious," he whispered. Broll leaned in. "You see something?" Delling didn't answer right away. Instead, he rotated the lens by degrees, his eye pressed close, his brow furrowed deeper with each turn. "The depth is off," he said at last, sitting back on his heels. "The frame, it distorts the room. Only within the door's borders. You'd expect barrel distortion with this kind of exposure, or lens curvature. But this," he tapped the edge of the glass, "this bends inward as if light had to pass through liquid to settle here." Broll scribbled notes, though his hand shook slightly. The second man stepped forward. Dr. Wren Bickford, a compact, bearded metallurgist from Haddonworth Laboratories, wore a lab coat too clean for the dusty archive. He didn't believe in ghosts. "Silver nitrate degradation," he said matter-of-factly. "Let's see if it's that." He retrieved a portable testing scope and examined the emulsion layer under magnified light. For 20 minutes, he muttered to himself, cataloging the grain alignment, checking for fatigue in the gelatin, assessing edge wear. Finally, he stood straight and declared, "No silver run, no nitrate fatigue, no layering faults. It's not a contamination. The glass is true." Broll blinked. "So, if it's not the lens, not the chemistry, then it's the subject," Bickford interrupted, "or the moment itself." The third specialist was Giles Hantham, a restoration technician and collector of antique camera equipment. He had tracked down the original device used in the 1883 sitting, a Mulgrave Box Model 3, still functional. That morning, he had tested it at the same focal distance and lighting approximation used in the studio. The result? Perfect alignment. No visual anomalies. No internal mirrors or backdoor plates. Nothing unusual. "This camera couldn't have produced that door unless the door was there," he said flatly. They fell silent. In the background, the gas lamp hissed. Broll turned to a file marked March 1915. He slid out a museum catalog card and read aloud, "During the February exhibition, room temperature dropped by 11 degrees Fahrenheit the moment the plate was uncovered. Multiple guests reported lightheadedness. One woman fainted. Giles raised an eyebrow. Still think it's a trick of optics?" Delling cleared his throat. "Optics may bend light, but not temperature." That same evening, Broll sent a telegraph to Bellbrooke's mayor. His fingers hesitated only once, hovering above the brass key before he tapped out the words, "Recommend withdrawal from exhibit." Guests unsettled by print. Unnatural stillness reported. The next day, the door plate was removed from public display, but not before a final observation was noted in the archive's official report. It came from Delling, who returned one last time to examine the framing. "The shadow," he had said, pointing at the lower quadrant. "Look at Lyle's shadow." It bends into the frame of the door. Broll leaned closer. Indeed, the faint silhouette cast by Gregory Lyle's form didn't fall away from the door, but turned unnaturally toward it, like smoke caught in a draft. "And there," Delling added, voice low, the reflection in the upper pane. "That's the studio room behind him, but he's not in it. The room is empty." For several seconds, no one spoke. Outside, the weather had turned overcast, but there was no breeze to explain why the window in the viewing room creaked open a half-inch on its own. Brohl shut the drawer with a decisive clang. The plate returned to its lead-lined casing. Later that night, as he recorded the findings by hand, his pen hovered above the final line of his notes. He paused, swallowed, and wrote it down exactly as Delling had spoken it. There was no light source that could have cast that shadow. No angle that made that door fit the room. The door had no knob, no handle, no latch, no visible seam. And yet it stood there, complete and intact, arched, black-stained, with 6 tall panes of vertical glass inside a photograph that should have shown only a bare studio wall. Professor Amos Delling stared at it for a long time before speaking. The light in the Northridge Preservation Room was soft and amber, filtered through green glass domes. He leaned closer, adjusting the position of the plate under the gaslight. His gloved fingers hovered near the emulsion surface, careful not to touch. "It's not misalignment," he murmured, eyes narrowing, "and it's not compression warp." Archivist Henry Brohl stood just behind him, arms folded tight across his chest. "You're certain?" "I've studied silvering anomalies for 30 years, Delling said, pulling a long metal pointer from his coat pocket and tapping gently against the edge of the glass plate. "But this is layered from within. The depth reads wrong. The door projects, yes, but its base floats above the floorboard by nearly 2 inches. And here—" He traced the lower edge of the door frame with the pointer, where Gregory Lyle's shadow bent upward unnaturally. "It defies linear optics." Brohl shifted uncomfortably. "Could it be double exposure?" "No." Delling was quick, almost sharp now. "There's no ghosting, no secondary edge blur. The emulsion isn't stressed. I checked under the spathic lens myself." Brohl hesitated, then reached into the cabinet and withdrew a thin envelope. "Then perhaps you should see this." Inside was a child's drawing. Faded crayon, paper browned at the corners. The drawing showed a hillside, jagged green against a yellow sky. At its center, the same door, arched, black, suspended slightly above the grass. A rough label scribbled beside it in a child's hand read, "Open now." "Where did this come from?" Delling asked, frowning deeply. "Bellbrooke School Archives. Dated March 1884. A boy named Elias Creel." 8 years old, Delling said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the drawing as if something in it tugged at the edge of memory. The next day, a second opinion arrived. Constable Herman Cleves, broad-shouldered, gray-mustached, and known more for practical judgment than poetry, reviewed the image in silence for nearly 20 minutes. He smoked a pipe while pacing the perimeter of the museum room. "Harlan was clever," he finally said. "Folk around town always said his studio was a stage. Maybe he built the door, used it in those night sittings. The seances—" "There's no record of seances at the studio," Brohl replied. "There wouldn't be," Cleves muttered. "Not if they were private." "But even if he built it," Brohl added carefully, "why no mention in any of the construction notes? No wood shavings, no hinges recovered during demolition, no nails. And that studio had only one back wall, solid masonry." Cleves exhaled a plume of smoke, then tapped the photograph with the tip of his pipe. "Maybe it was a trick." "Painted it on canvas." Set it up for show, Brohl walked over to the storage drawer, pulled out the demolition notes from 1896, and flipped through until he found the post-fire record. "Listen to this. Wall remains intact after structural collapse. No sign of added material, frame backing, or interior bracing." He closed the file. "If Harlan painted it, he painted on air." Neither man spoke for a while. Then Cleves put out his pipe and left the room without another word. By week's end, they called in one final voice, Ellison Crane, the town folklorist. Thin, tall, with sharp eyes and the nervous energy of a man who'd spent too long listening to stories no one else believed. He entered the archive carrying a folder of clippings, notes, and transcripts gathered over decades. "I've seen it before," Crane said quietly as he stood before the plate. "Not in life, not directly, but in accounts, dreams, sketches, old letters." Delling raised an eyebrow. "Dreams?" "Yes, men waking with frost at their fingertips, talking in their sleep. 'The black door,' they'd say, or sometimes just 'the standing glass.' Always the same description, narrow panes, no knob, no frame." Crane placed a journal page on the table. It was dated 1904. In it, a man named Robert Keene described dreaming of a door in a field, hearing whispers through its glass. He never approached. He woke, screaming. "It's not a structure," Crane said. "It's an event." The room was silent. "You think it opens?" Brohl asked after a moment. Crane shook his head. "No, I think it's already open." Delling scoffed, but softly. "That would suggest what? A threshold? To where?" "I don't know," Crane replied, "only that no one walks away from it unchanged." Each man retreated to his own corner of belief. Delling returned to his lab, scouring the plate again with optical refractors and exposure baths, trying to replicate the anomaly on new glass. Cleves searched studio inventories, town ordinances, even arrest records, hunting for proof of fraud. And Crane? Crane visited the schoolhouse again, alone, and requested permission to view old student files. What he found he never disclosed, but he mailed a sealed envelope to the Bellbrooke Antiquarian Society with instructions to open it only if the door appears again. Weeks passed. No new evidence emerged. No other photographs showed the anomaly. But at night, the plate room grew colder. One guard refused to enter after dusk. Another claimed he saw his reflection bend sideways in the glass. And still, the door remained. Crisp, centered, impossible. Each theory stood on its own. Plausible, yes, but hollow. Delling's scientific explanation lacked an error. Cleves's criminal suspicion lacked motive, and Crane's paranormal interpretation lacked precedent. But all three men, each from a different world, had described the same uneasy truth in different ways. That silence gathered at the edges of the image, that the plate seemed to absorb not just light, but attention, warmth, breath. As Brohl noted in his final report before sealing the plate in a lead-lined drawer, "No one has ever captured that door again, but once seen, some say they begin to dream of it." At exactly 3:17 a.m., a sound like glass cracking under pressure rang out across the east wing of Northridge Historical Annex. The sharp echo of it startled night watchman Louis Fenn, who had been dozing lightly in his wooden chair beneath the ticking station clock. He stood abruptly, hand on his flashlight, pulse spiking beneath his wool vest. The sound had come from the restoration room. Fenn moved quickly, boots squeaking faintly on the stone floor as he approached the door marked Archival Development. Fragile plates only. It was ajar, the glow from a single green lamp spilling into the hallway like a ghost's breath. Inside, the air was thick, unnaturally cold, colder than any other room in the building. The hairs on Fenn's forearms rose beneath his sleeves. "Mr. Brohl," he called. No response. Henry Brohl sat slumped at his workstation, head tilted forward, hands resting limply on the arms of the chair. His eyes were open, too wide. The pupils were dilated, glassy. His lips were parted just slightly, twitching as though mouthing something silent and urgent. The tray beside him had tipped, sending chemical solution spilling across the work table and dripping slowly to the floor like syrup. The glass plate, the one marked G. Lyle, do not enlarge, lay intact in the puddle, glinting dully under the lamplight. Fenn moved toward him, speaking again with more force. "Mr. Brohl." "Sir, can you hear me?" Still nothing. He knelt beside the archivist, fingers brushing Henry's wrist. A pulse, faint but present. Breathing, shallow. Skin cold as the solution he worked with. Fenn reached for the emergency bell, sounding the building alarm to summon medical aid from the university's infirmary across campus. Within 20 minutes, 2 orderlies arrived and confirmed that Brohl was not in physical distress. No stroke, no seizure, no sign of trauma. But he would not respond. He blinked, but didn't speak. When gently lifted from the chair, his hands clutched air as if resisting something unseen. He didn't speak a coherent word until 4 hours later. At 7:21 a.m., as the sun sent pale beams through the frosted glass panes of the eastern wall, Brohl stirred on the infirmary cot. He blinked against the light, sat up stiffly, and whispered just 5 words. The door didn't open. It turned. He said it again, then again. A third time, louder. His voice was hoarse but deliberate. When asked what he meant, his expression changed, as if he had realized something too late. He shook his head once, violently, and refused to speak further. Not that day, not for weeks. Back at the restoration room, the aftermath revealed strange details. The Mulgrave timer on the wall, which had been keeping time consistently for over 2 decades, had stopped. Exactly 3:17 a.m. The same time, Fenn heard the sound. Yet no sign of malfunction could be found. Its gears were clean, its spring intact. The chemicals in the development tray, though partially spilled, had not damaged the glass plate. In fact, the image of Gregory Lyle was sharper than it had ever been, almost crystalline. But something was different, subtle, nearly missed. The faint outline of the door frame now shimmered along the edges, as though the light had fractured ever so slightly inside the negative. Later that evening, senior archivist Daniel Marsh, along with 2 museum trustees, made the decision to withdraw the Lyle plate from public rotation. A special lead-lined drawer was procured, typically used for storing early radium-damaged documentation, and the plate was sealed inside. "I don't want that thing upstairs," Marsh reportedly said. "Whatever it is, it saw something, or someone saw through it." No official announcement was made. The exhibit brochure was quietly revised. The number of displayed plates adjusted from 23 to 22. The plate was sent back to Bellbrooke under confidential transport, its shipment disguised among mundane civic documents. Upon arrival, it was mislabeled as Lyle, Georgia. Civic Portrait, and filed into the museum's basement archive, drawer A18. No curator was assigned to monitor it. No mention was made in public catalogs. Years passed. In 1986, during a hasty digitization project for a regional archives conference, a scan of the plate was uploaded by mistake. For 4 days it sat on a university database labeled simply unknown_1883_subject_composite. A grad student posted the link to a forum on historic tintypes. By the morning of day 5, the file had vanished. The university received a request, anonymous, but signed in legal language, to remove the scan from all public-facing servers. The original digital negative was wiped from 3 machines. Backup logs were erased. When asked about the incident, the only reply came from an unnamed system administrator. "We didn't know it had been uploaded. And I don't remember removing it." From that moment onward, no one outside the Bellbrooke Museum's locked archives has laid eyes on the original. To this day, the negative remains sealed in a locked drawer, and the door has not been seen since. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of mystery, the unknown, and humanity's search for meaning beyond what can be explained. Its purpose is to spark imagination, provoke curiosity, and remind us how wonder and fear often walk hand in hand in the face of the unexplained.